Welcome to the new academic year and to Torch Book at Lunchtime. I'm Christine Gerard. I have the privilege of being the director of Torch, and I enjoy being able to introduce these wonderful volumes that we talk about. Torch Book at Lunchtime is now celebrating its 13th Michaelmas term today, and we're welcoming a truly outstanding book written by Professor Susan Doran, from Tudor to Stuart. And Susan, I'm probably pronouncing your surname wrong because I've been doing this all day long.
You have, yes, it's Doran.
Doran, there we are, you see. So,
should rhyme with Moran.
right. Book at Lunchtime, as I said, has been going, this is now its 13th year. It began with the founding of Torch in 2013. And we have every book on film and on our YouTube channel, a very popular resource for those people who cannot see the event live, as we are privileged to do today. So today we welcome an expert panel to discuss this highly acclaimed book. And I will read a little from the reviews, and one in particular in the Financial Times that I have to quote from at some length. This is Professor Doran's account of one of the most consequential regime changes in British history. It brought a Scottish king to England, where he became James I, and laid the foundations for the dream he cherished of a perfect union between the two countries. That dream would become reality a century later, under his great-granddaughter Queen Anne, with the Act of Union in 1707. In the meantime, James contented himself by systematising both the Scottish plantation of Ulster, which Doran wryly notes has left a profound mark on the history of the island, even until today, and the colonisation of America. One of the delightful aspects of this book is the author's flair for cultural history and literary readings, alongside her mastery of the politics and economics of the period. From Tudor to Stuart will surely land on every student reading list, not only because of Doran's pedigree, but because it manages to give us a new perspective on an overstudied period. Perhaps 1603 wasn't the end of a glorious period. Everything changed. Everything stayed the same. And joining Susan today are Professors Paulina Hughes and Professor Stephen Gunn. With that, I would like to hand over to our chair for proceeding. Paulina will guide us through today's discussion and this key period of English history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I introduce Professor Doran? She has been associated across the years with all manner of institutions whose names start with Saint. She had been a student at St. Anne's. She taught at St. Paul's Girls' School. She taught at St. Mary's, and later on she came to Oxford and became a fellow of St. Benet's. And then she also joined Jesus College, and to this day is teaching for a number of colleges in Oxford, including St. John's. Sue has written extensively about Tudor history, and what is extremely distinctive about her writing is that, as well as producing extraordinarily influential studies, both in the form of articles and books, which are extremely scholarly and really for the experts, she also writes a lot for the general public. And in fact, this book is a perfect example. You will find copious notes at the back, references to the latest scholarship, as well as to a lot of manuscript material, but the text is written beautifully, fluently, clearly, and anyone can follow the argument. And she also brings the perspectives of literature and history and visual art together. Professor Stephen Gunn, a fellow of Merton, where he's taught for many years, and professor in the history faculty, is another extremely influential and extensively published historian. He's also a wonderful citizen, always doing what needs to be done for the students, for the faculty, and for his college. And he has recently completed a book on everyday life and accidental death in Tudor England. And I attended a paper that Steve gave on the book then in progress a few years ago. And my favorite example was of somebody killing themselves on a spit because they started dancing in the kitchen. And obviously it was providential. You should never dance in the kitchen. So without further ado, let's have Professor Doran read from her book.
What I'm going to do is to read, I hope I have time for 3 extracts. The book is divided in 3 parts, and I wanted to read a very short extract, which in many ways summed up at least one chapter in each of the parts. The first part deals with a kind of introduction to James, an introduction to the problems that he faced, and indeed his first year as King of England. So I will start off with that. Unusually, James was a political veteran when he became King of England. Indeed, he was the first King of England to have previously been a monarch elsewhere. His political battles and practices in Scotland inevitably affected his rule in his new realm. Having been attacked by radical Presbyterians in the Kirk, James would demand loyalty and obedience, indeed conformity, from all his English subjects. As in Scotland, he would maintain a broad-based government. His English Privy Council was to include Protestants and crypto-Catholics, Englishmen and Scots, and men from previously rival factions. In his Scottish speeches and writings, he had constructed himself as a father to his people and a physician to the body politic. He was to do the same in England and show himself open to reforms in the English church and state. Additionally, James regularly repeated his articulation of the divine right of kings in both his pre- and post-1603 political writings. And finally, James's favoured strategy of masking his intentions, and hiding behind plausible deniability remained a constant feature of his style of rule. As we shall see in later chapters, James I of England differed little from James VI of Scotland. The second and third parts of the book address a key question, what runs right the way through the book, which is what was new, what was the same? Was 1603 a watershed in British history? And I'm going to just read from one of the chapters in the second part of the book, which looks at people and institutions. The third part looks at policies, both at home and abroad. So on the second side, this is about the royal family, because obviously one of the big differences between James and Elizabeth is that she was, as we all know, the Virgin Queen, at least we think she was, and James was not just married, but he was also, he had 2 sons who were living by the time he came down to England, and a daughter. On the positive side, the presence of a royal family was beneficial to the crown because of the opportunities it offered for celebratory functions, baptisms, investitures, and marriage that enhanced the grandeur and splendour of monarchy, both at court and in the provinces. On St. George's Day in 1610, for example, Prince Henry's investiture as Prince of Wales occasioned the performance of the pageant Chester's Triumph in honour of her prince in the Cheshire town. Furthermore, a young and good-looking royal family was more glamorous than the elderly figure of Elizabeth, who could not hide her wrinkled skin and rotting teeth during the last years of her life. And since the conduct of Anna and her children was dignified, it brought esteem to a court which intermittently appeared disorderly. Henry built up a reputation as a morally principled young man, while Anna was viewed as a chaste and rich in virtue. Although more in the background, Princess Elizabeth was noted as a beauty and most graceful in dancing and all her other actions during her appearances at court. And of course, her wedding made a huge splash. On the negative side, the expenditure of the royal household rocketed. The total cost of the wardrobe during the first 5 years of James's reign was set at £83,900, which contrasted sharply with the £21,300 spent in the last 5 years of Elizabeth's reign. By the end of 1604, the Privy Council was growing concerned about the increase and suggesting royal discipline, while after the Christmas revels of 1604-5, ordinary people were complaining about the wasteful and idle expense in the court. I'm now going to read my section to the last part. And this is the introduction to a chapter which in many ways has already been referred to. It's about union. It's called Union and Empire. And it's the introduction to that. And again, I think you get a sense of what I'm trying to do in the book. Okay. Unlike the previous 2 chapters, which were on religion, which revealed continuities, this one argues for change. Although the idea of an Anglo-Scottish union did not come out of the blue, James's attempt to create a union after 1603 was so controversial that for a time it replaced the Elizabethan succession issue as a major cause of conflict between monarch and commons. By 1607, the union project had pretty much failed in Parliament, but James's efforts to bring his 2 realms closer together set in motion tensions that lasted throughout the reign and beyond. In England, there was not only disquiet about an imagined flood of Scots moving south, but also a suspicion of the political ideas James articulated during the union debates. In Scotland, there was political resistance, mainly unsuccessful, when James brought English practices into the Kirk, the Scottish Church, and an armed rising in 1639 when Charles I attempted to introduce a new prayer book into his northern realm. Multiple kingdoms were common in Europe, but also very difficult to manage, as the revolt of the Netherlands had already demonstrated in the late 16th century, and the revolts in Catalonia and Portugal were to do in 1640. James, of course, also inherited the Kingdom of Ireland in 1603. Although he had no intention of absorbing that realm into his new political union, his rule there differed from that of his predecessor in one crucial respect, largely resulting from the Union project. Whereas Elizabeth had tried to keep the Scots out of Ireland, James encouraged them to settle there in the new plantations established in the north. I'll move on quickly. I won't say any more about that, so I'll move to America. England's colonisation of America effectively began under James. The imperial ambitions of Jacobeans in the New World were no different from those of Elizabethans. What was different was their actualisation. Despite a shaky start, a settlement became well established at Jamestown and soon was followed by the foundation of further colonies in Virginia, New England, and the West Indies. Initially left behind in the scramble for colonies, England became, under the Stuarts, a rival to the Dutch and French in their expansion in the Americas. For all these reasons, James's accession in 1603 should be seen as a key date in both British and imperial history. Under its Scottish king, England retained its political independence, but it acquired a new appellation, Great Britain, a new relationship with Scotland, a new shared plantation in Ireland, and new Atlantic colonies. These developments, all of which began during the first decade of his reign, are the subject of this chapter.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'd like to say just a few words about the book and then pass over to Professor Gunn. And afterwards, I'll invite questions from the floor that I'm sure Sue will be very happy to answer. I'd like to emphasize a few aspects of the book which are very distinctive and which draw our attention to its extraordinary originality. there has been a lot of work done, in recent years especially, on the question of succession in the reign of Elizabeth. And Sue and I are guilty of editing a volume for which we co-wrote a couple of chapters precisely on that question. But the title of that book was very much The Question of Succession in Late Elizabethan England. There was quite a lot in it about James, but he didn't feature in the title. And overall, the reign of Elizabeth has received an enormous amount of attention. James has been studied rather less frequently, and because of the mid-17th century scathing reports, actually fake reports on his reputation, which keep getting recycled in scholarship, he is seen as much more of a far lesser man and lesser monarch than Elizabeth. And people who study him rarely look back extensively to Elizabeth, and those who study Elizabeth will only mention James in order to emphasize decline. Whereas what Sue has done is bring the two reigns together, and to bring them together in a way that assesses them and compares what has changed and what remained the same in all sorts of realms, whether it's to do with the entertainments at court or policy vis-à-vis the Netherlands or the questions of religion. It's all there. And it's quite impressive also because historians very often stick to their own period. And Sue has always written about the Tudors. She's one of the most acclaimed historians of Tudor England worldwide. So it was something of a new adventure for her to study James. And I feel I was sort of part of that adventure because we did a lot of walking and talking about the book during COVID when we couldn't sit in the same room. And it was extremely exciting to see how the book was taking shape, what questions were arising. And I had the privilege of hearing an early version of one of the chapters, A Jagged Succession, which dealt precisely with how normally people think of the accession of James as smooth. The word smooth keeps popping up everywhere. And what Sue did in that paper, which was delivered at the Huntington Library at a conference which actually was called Regime Change, which I co-organized with an American historian, Norman Jones, Sue was emphasizing that far from being as smooth as people have assumed, that the succession was actually a little bumpy, and she looked very closely at how people reacted, at how James reacted, at the different texts that circulated. And of course, there wasn't the kind of PR machine that we now have with the internet. In different parts of the country, people were learning at different moments that James had been proclaimed. They were afraid to proclaim them and welcome him themselves because they weren't sure if there might not be somebody else rising. In terms of how those who were proclaiming him were justifying his title. Again, there was variety. We have some who are emphasizing his blood claim, because after all, he was descended from Henry VIII's sister, the daughter of Henry VII, Margaret, Queen of Scotland. But there were others who felt that hereditary titles were less important, and that what really mattered was the fact that he was acclaimed by the people. There was a particular preacher who described him as an elected king, a Sabine, like Numa Pompilius, an early king of Rome. And we encounter this variety of claims in Sue's book, and that sets the stage for how James himself later on guides his subjects and propagandists to present him as a 100% legitimate hereditary monarch. Steve.
I wasn't sure of the format, so some of what I'm going to do is say things which are intended as questions for Sue to sort of set up discussion a bit. The first thing I'd say is I think in some ways I would see the historiography that's the background for what you're writing slightly differently from Paulina, in that my sense is that the last 30 years have seen a major reassessment of James in which his reputation's gone up, but the main vehicle of that has not been saying, here's Elizabeth in England, here's James in England. It's saying, here's James in Scotland. He seems to be very good at that. So how come everybody thinks he's useless at being King of England? And it's an argument associated with Jenny Wormald, who used to be here in Oxford, but also with Ken Fincham writing about the church and others. So in a sense, we've got a James who's very competent, and we've also got an Elizabethan regime that works. But what Sue's doing is putting those things together, which is by and large what people haven't done so well before. And it seems to me one of the strengths of the book is precisely that it's able to say, let's focus very closely on 1603 and what's happening on 1603, hence the jagged succession and so on. But that does create problems of structure which any big book has. You have to make strategic choices in structuring a book like this. And I think what you've done is very interesting, because if I understand my take on what you've done is that you zoom in very closely on 1603, and we have a sort of slow motion account of 1603 to 4, which is very useful because it means that things that in thematic books on James get kept apart, so Parliament goes in the Parliament chapter, peace with Spain goes in the foreign relations chapter, entry into London goes in the public relations chapter or whatever, all those things are together because James is going through them at the same time. So that's very useful. Then in order to make sense of things, you then have to have thematic chapters later on, like the what are you going to do about the Puritans chapter and the what are you going to do about the Catholics chapter. In some ways, I think you turn that to advantage, because what it does, which other books don't manage to do, is to say, here's a short-term decision of great consequence, like the peace with Spain. But then other books say, well, there you go, that's the peace with Spain, that's foreign affairs done and dusted, now we can get on with something else. Actually, what you then say, partly because you've got length in the book to say it, is to say, but actually that doesn't just mean that trade goes entirely back to normal with Spain. That doesn't mean that you can suddenly say, well, the Spanish don't seem to mind us having a colony in Virginia, despite the fact they think they own the Americas. So those ongoing issues, I think, come up in very interesting ways. But was that something you wrestled with, I suppose I wanted to know?
Yes. One of the things, the way I approach research initially is to start with primary sources. I mean, obviously I teach this period, so I have a kind of general view of what people are saying about it. And the way I do my primary sources really, I think, comes from my age, because I'm a pre-computer person who started research. And I used to start with shoeboxes and card indexes. And each of my cards that would go in the index had a date, and everything was organized chronologically. And I can't get out of that. So if you look at, which none of you will do, of course, look at the files on my computer, the notes are organized chronologically through sources. That's the starting point. And as I started to do this, I realized that 1603 had to be dealt with exactly in the way that you say, because there's so much happening at the same time. And I wanted to ensure that it was appreciated as how James and the subjects were seeing the year. So that was it. And so many things happen, like plague and a whole range of things, plots. And then there's a coronation somewhere in there. So that was the first part. And then when I moved on, what drove me was the question. And I realized that I couldn't answer that question sharply enough if I was going to write a chronological telling the story, because the story would take over. And there are stories here, by the way, lots of stories, and some of which I didn't know beforehand, like the second part of the gunpowder plot, what happened after they failed to blow up Parliament. But I realized that in order to, as I say, focus on those questions, I needed to be thematic. And there was another reason too. As Paulina has said, I don't write interdisciplinary history. I write history. But what I write is holistic history. And holistic history means that I am interested in not just religion and politics, which obviously go together, but also in more cultural dimensions. And I'm interested in cultural dimensions which sometimes on the surface may not seem as if they are political. To give an example, obviously political in terms of cultural history are the masks that are put on at the early Stuart court by Anna, and I spend a lot of time talking about them and their political significance. But there are also responses to this notion of what does it mean to be British? And one of the ways to access that and to try and get into that is by looking at some of the plays at the time. And that's where I bring in literature. And of course, I'm interested in patronage, so issues surrounding new palaces and paintings, they also come. You can't do that if you're telling the story primarily. And the danger of telling that story primarily is either it's going to be incoherent because you suddenly break off and say, I wanted to talk about measure for measure, or you have to leave it out. And I decided that there are disadvantages, and I fully appreciate them. One of my reviewers mentioned them in writing thematically. But on the whole, I think, and I'm glad you think so too, I think it works. And another advantage is if you're not interested in religion, you can leave it out.
What was, I mean, given that this was your first venture into the 17th century, what did strike you as something completely new and unexpected? What was your discovery that you found quite...
Well, I think one of the things that you've already mentioned, I will mention others as well, is this whole the contested nature of James's right to the throne. I think I did find that new, and not only did it stop with some people, saying James had the right to the throne because it was by blood, and others saying he was elected, but it went right the way through to the coronation. And I read the coronation, both the speech at the coronation, which emphasizes divine right, and also, I think, James omitting part of the traditional coronation, which involves acclamation, so that it becomes an acclamation, more clearly an acclamation, and not an election. Those sorts of things had not really, I think, been fully appreciated. Unfortunately, while I was writing it, somebody did start to appreciate it, and that was Alice Hunt, who wrote an article. But I got there independently, and it was something that was new to me. The other area of novelty is, one of the problems when you're writing a general history book is that you can't talk about historiography. It has to go into the notes. You're not allowed to say, so-and-so wrote this, somebody wrote that, I think that. Occasionally you can slip it in, but on the whole, historiography is an out. But it's so important. And one of the things that I think really influenced me was what really you're talking about, Steve, is some of the newer historiography, which is, in many ways, is praising James. So Ken Fincham and Peter Lake, some years ago now, wrote an article which presented the Jacobean Church as being harmonious. And then, of course, it was all made, it all went wrong under Charles. Well, anyone who reads my two chapters on the church will realize I do not think it was harmonious at all. I think the same kinds of divisions were present under certainly early James. My book ends in 1612. I'll explain why afterwards, if you ask. And that in many ways you have one of the greatest purges of the church under early James, and that really his policy towards Protestants and Catholics differs very little from that of Elizabeth. So I think that was another one of those kinds of changes in the way I had viewed James, partly from historiography that I was familiar with through teaching undergraduates and that I engaged with.
Because that's in many ways related to the fact that there were enormous expectations shared by so many except that they were conflicting. Puritans expected further reformation of the church. Catholics expected toleration and perhaps that Henry would follow in the footsteps of Henry IV of France and convert to Catholicism. Mainline Protestants thought that things would stay the same. And of course, he was bound to disappoint everybody.
Yes, and the important thing, and this is another discovery for me, and you and I about this probably come to the fore. It's taken me a long time to write this book, and lots of new things have been written while it's been in the production process and while I've been writing it. So not everything that I say is necessarily new to historians out there, but it certainly was new to me. And one of the things that was new to me were the number of petitions that were being sent in 1603. In Lansdowne manuscripts, there's a list of the petitions, very briefly labelling them, and some of them are personal. A lot of them are political. Some of them are asking for jobs, of course, but there are other major petitions, not in the Lansdowne, but in Stone manuscripts and elsewhere, which are from Puritans and also from Catholics. And of course, as Paulina says, they want diametrically opposed things. There is no way James can be all things to all men, even though at times he does try to be. Yes, well, there were two plots in 1603, and that would not have led to Elizabeth II. It might have led to a Queen Arabella, Arabella Stuart, though in fact not really anybody thought she was suitable for the task. So that was one of the weaknesses of the plotters, who on earth was going to be put on the throne. The first plot was called the by-plot, which meant it was actually of secondary importance, though to my mind it was the main plot. There was another plot called the main plot, but just to confuse us. The by-plot was by priests, and what I think they were trying to do was replicate the sorts of actions that had occurred in Scotland, which was not to overthrow the king and put somebody else on the throne, but to capture the king, remove from him all the undesirable councillors, and hold him virtual prisoner until he agreed to the Catholic toleration that they were demanding. And it was very much that kind of repetition of a pattern that had occurred in Scotland in the 1580s and even what possibly was attempted with the Gowrie plot. It went wrong on two counts. One was they couldn't get enough Catholics in England to be part of it. So they thought they were going to have to bring in some other people who were disaffected, and they included Protestants. But even they didn't make enough of it, and it began to leak out. And another reason for it going wrong was that the Catholics themselves were divided. They were divided between Jesuits on the one hand and those that we can call seminarians or sectarian priests, the parish priest strand of, and they started to try, and because of that division, it resulted in the whole thing being leaked and being linked to Archbishop, well, he wasn't Archbishop then, but Bishop Bancroft of London. And so the whole thing fell apart. That was the by-plot. The main plot should be called the murky plot. I'm not 100% convinced there actually was a serious plot. Maybe that's because I like Walter Raleigh. It could be. I was moved to tears reading his account, his defense of himself in the trial. He's such a, and in fact, sorry, I'm going off. I'm not being focused. I'll get back to the main plot. But in the trial, the commentators, there are some commentators. One is Dudley Carlton, and he says, the only reason they found him guilty is because they don't like him. I mean, there's no evidence at all, because Raleigh had built up a reputation over the years as a monopolist, as the Queen's favourite, a whole range of things, deceitful. He was known as raw lie, and that's why they found him guilty. I'm not convinced there was a plot, but the plot supposedly was that Cobham and Raleigh together were planning with the Spanish, very unlikely, to put Arbella on the throne, very unlikely. But nevertheless, they did enough to make themselves objects of suspicion. I don't think it's Robert Cecil just going around trying to, throw off anyone who might be a competitor. I actually don't, and I'll tell you why. I think the problem with that is that it shows there's too much opposition to James. And one of the things they're trying to do is present the notion that there's a consensus of opinion. James is the man they all want. And this really creates an alternative version. And they've already told various people abroad in letters that, that James has taken the throne without a flicker of dissent. So I don't think that's what's happening. And the second reason I don't, and this was a section I almost wanted to read, but I didn't have time, is what actually happened, not so much at the show trial, but what happened at the show execution. Because there is an extraordinary drama when 3 of those involved in the plot are brought out. The Catholic priests have already been executed, but Cobham, somebody called Gervase Markham, and Lord Grey are due for execution. James wants Cobham to go first because he wants to find out the truth of Cobham's accusations against Wryly. And Cobham still remains committed to his line that Wryly was a conspirator. But what happens is that the first one comes out, puts his head on the scaffold, got Gervase Malcolm, and said, sorry, you're not ready. You said you hadn't expected this. Just go over into the main hall. So he does, and then they bring out Lord Grey, who gives a speech that's an hour long. And he's very religious. He's one of the Protestants that were brought into plotting. And they say to him, OK, I've just heard that Cobham's got to go before you. So Cobham's brought in, Grey's taken out. And then as Cobham is about to put his, he's already given his speech saying that it's Wryly who is correctly being accused. I hope I got these 3 in the right order. It doesn't matter. The point is, at the end, all 3 are brought out and they're looking, what's going on here? Are we in the afterworld? And the king's pardon is produced. And it's the kind of deus ex machina that is where the king is showing his authority. Why does he do it? I think he does it that way because he cannot afford to let men who are, there's 2 barons there. It's too much. It destroys that kind of myth of him being the welcome ruler. So I think that's one reason. And I think too that he wants to display his authority after these conspiracies, and rumours of them are going around. And I think thirdly that he chooses to present this pardon as an act of reciprocity, that because everyone has been so welcoming to him, he is not going to punish those few people, low-hanging fruit or not, who have plotted against him. So I think there is a lot of performance that's going on, but I don't think the show trial was part of it.
Well, you said that the pardon appears sort of deus ex machina, and you also referred to the royal performance, or several performances in that year. And I wonder whether you see a connection between these royal performances and the drama of the early Jacobean period, especially some of the Shakespeare plays.
Well, I certainly make a comparison in the book. One of the responses to the scene I have rather badly described in the end of Measure for Measure. You might want to think about that. I think some of the questions that are raised in Shakespeare's plays, and they are questions, not answers, do deal with issues surrounding legitimacy of monarchs. You see that in Macbeth, for example. They do deal with plots, which you also see in Macbeth. So I think there is a response to some of these problems that emerge not just in the first year, but thereafter in the drama. Yeah, it's and I do refer, as somebody said, a great deal to different plays in this period. Yes, I think the court of James is far more cosmopolitan than that of Elizabeth. That's unquestionable. It's partly personnel. I mean, obviously you've got the Scots coming in, but you also do have Danes. You have visitors from Germany who are coming in as well as the Danish king, as you well know. So I think that whether or not I think that one element that you could argue is clearly continental in its culture are the masks, which seem to be drawing on some of the ballet of that is at the French court, for example. So I do think there's quite a lot of yes, of borrowings and synthesis that is going on at that time. The whole of the European side I explore far more in foreign policy, because in addition to the peace with Spain, we also see James's involvement in the Ulick Cleves affair, where there are rival candidates. One of them is supported by Anna's family, and the other is not. But there's three actually candidates, and one is Catholic as well. And there's this whole question of whether James will come into it. And there are influences not just from the Dutch and from the Germans, but also the French, because Henry IV, although he's a Protestant, although he's a Catholic at this time, he is someone who wants to appear very much part of this anti-Habsburg strongman leader, and James doesn't really like it. James doesn't want to be left out in the cold. And so we see lots of negotiations and ways through that kind of a very complicated continental situation. Hope that helped.
Can I pick up on a different theme? As you said, you end the book in about 1610. 1612. How big do you think, because in a sense you don't have to pronounce on this in the book, how big do you think that mid-reign change is? Because some people in Elizabeth's reign talk about Elizabeth's second reign, and so on. People talk, or Henry VIII, people often talk about 1529 or 1530s as a break between two different kinds of kingship. So how big do you think that change is, and what do you think's driving it? So, because you could have an argument it was deaths, couldn't you? It's Cecil dying, it's Prince Henry dying, or it's arrivals, it's Buckingham, and that's why it all changes, or it's the 30 Years' War, and you can just blame the 30 Years' War for everything. Or so, how do we weigh those things up, do you think? And how different really is? Because one of the interesting things I think you bring out occasionally is how, as with Raleigh's reputation actually changes over the course of the reign. So in 1603 you can say, look, he's an atheist, Machiavellian, monopolist, surely he's the kind of person we shouldn't have around the king. And by 1618 you're saying, look, he's wonderful, he fights the Spaniards, he's creating an empire in the New World, and what's not to like? So is that symptomatic of other big changes?
Yes, I do hint that there is a change after 1612. I argue in part that the loss of Prince Henry created an emotional vacuum in James's life, and neither James nor Anna could comfort each other. That comes across very clearly. And that seems to me at that point that we start seeing James having friendships of a different kind with male courtiers. His relationship with Rochester, who later becomes Somerset, was always slightly homoerotic, but it becomes a much closer one, which creates opposition. And so you get the start of the factionalism that I think is strong. I haven't studied it, so I may be completely wrong. But it seems to me is much stronger, at any rate, in the post-1612. And Buckingham is brought in, of course, because he's got beautiful legs, and that means that James will therefore be attracted, and that will take him away from Cast, Rochester, Somerset. So you get that I think that is a very important way that court life and political life changes in the post-1612 period. You also get Prince Charles growing up and wanted a slice of the action. And that too has an influence, particularly in the later parliaments of James, when Charles is more assertive. I think that James is less adept in, as time goes by. Some have suggested to me that he had a stroke. I don't know when exactly, but he does not seem as healthy, as politically active, and as I say, politically adept in the later years. And then, of course, the whole international situation changes in a way that doesn't work well for James. James wants peace, if he can, largely because it's expensive to go to war. It's all the same reasons that Elizabeth wanted peace, effectively. But it becomes more and more difficult to stay out of the European adventures, or even limit the kind of engagement you're going to have with some of the wars that are going on in the continent. And I think that too is a very different situation. And some, of course, of the issues that are dominating the early part of James's reign are not there in the later part of the issue of union. Although, there are problems with it, it's not something that's going to come up in Parliament. They think they've dealt with it. So there are new problems. An underlying continuity is finance. And one could argue in some ways that Cranfield does rather a better job in managing the finances than Cecil does. But I think there are two reigns of James, but I will know more if I decide. I'm waiting till next year. It's the anniversary of James's death, and I'm waiting to see what comes out and if there's room for part two of, not from Tudor to Stuart, but from Stuart to Stuart.
You talked in your opening remarks about the New World and the expansion actually taking place under James. And I wonder if you could relate it to James's policy in Ireland, because after all, it's before James's accession that the decisive victory happens there, and it falls to James to exploit it.
Yes. Just before James came to the throne, there was the suppression, and a brutal suppression. I try not to use emotive language, but it was a brutal suppression of the Irish. A lot of the land was devastated, and plantations that had been there were uprooted. And the question was, well, what to do next? And the kind of agreement that had been made just as Elizabeth was dying, and she didn't know that this agreement had been made, was that the leader of the rebels, call him Hugh O'Neill or the Earl of Tyrone, would remain. He wouldn't be executed. That he would still have some form of lordship in Ulster, and James did keep to that. I think the problem with the collapse of that settlement had less to do with policies in London and more to do with the tensions that were in Ulster from what we call the New English, the soldiers on the ground, some of the new colonists, and the Gaelic lords, because there was an incompatibility there. There was martial law on the one hand, there was Gaelic lordship on the other. And most historians now think that Tyrone and his fellow lord, Tyrconnell, were probably plotting. But whether they were or not, the belief was that they were plotting. And they were summoned to London, and there was the flight of the Earls, what's called the flight of the Earls, that they left. Nobody wanted them on the continent. They just tried to get rid of them. They ended up in Rome. And it caused quite a lot of diplomatic incidents, because when they went to Flanders, this was something that was against the treaty that had been made in the Anglo-Spanish agreement of 1604. Anyway, the outcome was that there were their lands. They had huge lands, and they had to be, or it was decided that they would be redistributed, and that's the plantation policy. It was it wasn't new. There were plantations in Ireland prior to this. But what I say is new is that the Scots are brought into it, that they are given, the details of the percentages are in the book, not in my head, but they are given substantial chunks of the land as what's called underwriters, undertakers, and then they can distribute the land to tenants. So that's where you get that Scottish presence in Ulster, which is a Presbyterian presence in Ulster, alongside the English presence, which is not Presbyterian. I don't like using the word Anglican at this point. It's Protestant. It's the Elizabethan style Protestant, which of course changes over time. It's crucially important because that provides him with his legitimacy. As far as he is concerned, as I've said, he's not an elected monarch. He's not chosen because he's the best man for the job, or even because he's the last man standing, which is pretty much the case. It was because that he could trace his lineage through to Henry VII, and this is, it's reiterated in the entry into London, for example, that he is the heir to Henry VII. It's reiterated in his writings. It's constantly early in the reign making reference to not. I mean, what you might ask about his mother. So we can come on to that in a minute. But almost jumping two generations and focusing on the Henry VII and Elizabeth of York connection rather than that of Margaret, that of Darnley, and that of Mary. But of course, Mary comes into it with the removal of her tomb, her body, corpse, I think is probably the better word, from Peterborough, where she was entombed, to Westminster Abbey. And this is not new stuff. I think this is very well known, that Elizabeth doesn't leave a will and doesn't actually say what she wants. She doesn't have any plans for her tomb. It's probably an indication, along with others, that she really didn't want to think about her own death. There was no consideration of that in the way that some other monarchs did have. But Robert Cecil decided he was the one who was going to make sure that she had a proper tomb. And James was askance. And I think the impression I get anyway is that, okay, she can have her tomb as long as my mother also gets a tomb. And her tomb was placed in a part of the Abbey, Westminster Abbey, where she's on top of Mary. Mary has no tomb. There's just a little line saying Mary's underneath. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is in part of the Abbey, the chapel, where the people like Margaret Lennox, Margaret Beaufort are also there. And more money spent, I think, on Mary's tomb. And the person who is in charge of it is someone who was very sympathetic to Mary during Elizabeth's reign, and that's Henry Howard. He is usually described as a crypto-Catholic. He is a conforming Catholic. You know, church papist was a word of abuse. He's a Catholic. And he does all the design and works with the designers for it. And I think one point that's sometimes been lost, I mean, people have often said, yes, of course, there is Mary's tomb as the kind of summit of the Tudor and Stuart line. And then you have, Elizabeth being shunted off to the side. Shunted off to the side with Elizabeth are the tombs of James's dead daughters, who are, you can still see them in the tomb. So what you have there is, again, the whole theme of stunted infertility. I mean, in one case by choice, the other by early death. But it's like the family tree coming to an end. in this particular part, and of course they're women as well. James is a misogynist, no question about that.
I was going to say, talking about tombs, it's time to end, but we're ending on the line that James is a misogynist. Thank you so much, Sue, for sharing your insights into your own work and for talking about it with such verve and panache, and to Steve for your comments, and to all the audience for your questions. Buy this book. You will not regret it. Thank you very much.